In the popular imagination, the D-Day landings are heavily shaped by just one beach: the slaughter on Omaha and the heroic men who pushed through regardless. While certainly an important thing to remember, it has rather overshadowed the other landings, be it Utah or Gold, Juno, and Sword. Another aspect that is often overlooked because of this was the fleet gunfire support, ships firing ashore to protect the soldiers on the beaches. From the big battleships to the destroyers, often closing in dangerously close. Their crews risking life and limb to protect their comrades on the beach from German gunfire. Nowhere is this more apparent than with USS Corry, the only American destroyer lost that day. A ship that sailed so close to shore that her wreck remained partially above water after she sank, and a ship I've covered before, although that is quite an old video by this point. However, there was another destroyer sunk that day as well. The Norwegian destroyer Svenner, which has the dubious honor of being the only Allied warship sunk by the German Navy on June 6, 1944. Regardless, those two destroyers, Corry and Svenner, are the only Allied warships lost on June 6th. Two destroyers sunk in drastically different circumstances. Yet also two heroes that are often forgotten in the greater story of the D-Day landings. As such, we have today's video. A bit out of season, I'll admit. But despite this, we'll be looking at Corry and Svenner's sinkings. If you are interested in Corry's story as a whole, I'll link my old video. And Svenner, well, I'll get around to her eventually. In today's video, we'll only be looking to the end of their stories, starting with Corry, a Gleaves-class destroyer. This ship had, prior to D-Day, been something of a background fighter. She had spent the majority of her time on various escort duty, with a notable exception in the sinking of a U-boat U-801 on March 17, 1944. Corry didn't stand out. This made her assignment for the Normandy landings something of a surprise, because you see, Corry wasn't just one of the first ships heading for France. She was, in fact, the lead destroyer of the entire invasion force, scouting ahead for any dangers directed at the fleet. In this, she covered transports and heavier warships as they crossed the English Channel. Important work, to be sure, but the Germans didn't really contest that fleet. This was a result of several factors, from the successful misdirection toward Calais to the absolutely horrendous weather on June 5th. Regardless, the fleet was largely left alone until the actual invasion kicked off. For this, USS Corry would cover Utah Beach, the far less famous of the two American landings. Less famous, but not a cakewalk. While nowhere near as bad as the fighting at Omaha, there was still a need for shore bombardment. And for Corry, that meant starting around 4,000 yards from shore. The USS Corry website cites the ship moving in even closer, within 1,000 yards, 914 meters from shore. That's not quite sailing right up on the beach, but it's still extremely and dangerously close. And because of this close approach, Corry would spend 20 minutes or so dueling with German shore batteries. citing the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, while the aforementioned Corry website opts instead for, and I quote, over an hour, with a heated duel with the battery that lasted several minutes. For their part, the Germans seem to have confused her with a light cruiser, a common thing with American destroyers, particularly in the Pacific. Either way, I should make a quick note at this point. Corry was supposed to have an aircraft drop smoke to cover her. This was something done for most of the bombardment fleet that day, and is another point to keep in mind for Svenner later on. For the most part, this did its job. It covered the warships from direct German retaliation. But for Corry, well, not so much. Now, I've seen conflicting reports on if there was a malfunction that prevented the smoke from deploying properly, or if the plane was just shot down. Regardless of the truth there, Corry was left exposed to shore fire. The smoke that should have protected her simply wasn't there. That is why she was dueling with German shore batteries, as they could quite clearly see the destroyer. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander George Hoffman, didn't care much about this. As noted, Corry came within 1,000 yards of the beach, where her guns would fire several hundred shells toward the shore. A classic, if admittedly extreme, example of the courage on D-Day. Many in the bombardment fleet would take similar risks. Corry would, unlike most, pay for that risk. It's here where things get a tad murky. The initial report of her sinking indicated the ship was hit by shore fire, specifically from an 8-inch gun battery. This report from Commander Hoffman was put through on June 9, 1944. It describes how, at approximately H-hour, that is 6:30 a.m., Corry was hit by a salvo of 2 or 3 shells. Hoffman describes them as 8-inch shells, where they cut through the destroyer, detonating in the engineering spaces. They broke Corry's keel, causing the immediate flooding of one engine room, one fire room, and the subsequent flooding of the other fire room, ultimately culminating in the ship breaking in two after her jammed rudder forced her into a circle. What is noted in every report of the loss is the raw concussion of the fatal damage. Corry shook heavily, knocking men from their feet. The Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships adds this: floor plates were torn loose and the sound of rushing water could be heard. Regardless, by 6:39, Corry was clearly doomed, despite hand steering and an effort to rig tow lines to the ship's boats. As such, the order went out to abandon ship. Hoffman would be the final one to leave his ship, earning himself a Silver Star for his courage that day. Those men would have to spend 2 hours in the sea, or alternatively, scrambling back aboard Corry's wreck. By the end of it all, 24 crew were lost and 60 more wounded. This is mostly where Corry's story came to its end. However, that initial June 9th report was just that, the initial loss report. The official report was to come later, once everything had been sorted out and written down. Though it should be noted that Hoffman gave an interview with CBS on June 9th that held to the shelling argument. Still, it's here where things reportedly get weird. Hoffman had, evidently, written a detailed report describing the shelling damage, only for that report at the very last minute to be scrapped and changed to a mine, with the only reference to shell damage coming at the very end of the report, described as incidental damage at the same time the mine went off. Thus, the official story of Corry's sinking states the ship struck a mine at 6:33 and it broke her back. This was controversial at the time and has remained so ever since. As the Corry website goes into detail, there are some issues with this story. Official reports from other sources, such as the 7th Cruiser Division, cite shelling, with this one going a step further by pointing out that no such report about the mining was received on D-Day. The crew, meanwhile, cite Corry's damage as being different from a mine, saying they were thrown toward the center of the ship as Corry buckled, thrusting her bow and stern up when the keel snapped, instead of the amidship section driven up by a mine pushing the bow and stern down. In addition to the ship being driven sideways and away from the beach, consistent with shell hits to the port side facing shore, as opposed to the mine, which is supposedly hitting the starboard side, which would have driven Corry towards the shore. Furthermore, the German battle reports cite shell hits at 6:35 a.m., 2 minutes after Corry's reported damage. Easy enough to rationalize, as different clocks reading time slightly differently. Nonetheless, the mine story remains the official reason for Corry's loss. I'll link the website if you're interested in the counter-argument. Either way, there's one more thing to note about Corry for the moment, and that is the ship's flag. As the destroyer sank, one of her crew took the time to remove this from the stern and raise it on the mainmast. Corry sank in such shallow water, 30 feet or about 9 meters, that she remained largely above the surface. That flag is, as a result, sometimes considered the first American flag raised on French soil during the landing. Is that a technicality? Yeah, probably. Is it also a fine story and something that the crew of USS Corry can be proud of? Definitely yes. It's certainly something worth remembering, no matter what course of events you believe in relation to the sinking. And it's also where we'll shift from Corry to Svenner. Although, one final note. To my knowledge, while partially scrapped, Corry's wreck remains there to this day. And now for Svenner. This ship has far less written on her sinking, at least in English. Quite likely because there isn't an equivalent to the deeply detailed and well-researched Corry website. What also doesn't help is how short her service really was. Corry may not have gone up to much, but she at least had a fairly lengthy pre-Normandy service. Well, as much as 2 years can be considered lengthy. But I digress. Svenner was laid down in 1941, expected to be named HMS Shark. However, she would be transferred to the Norwegian fleet in exile instead, with the ship launched in June 1943, but only commissioned on March 11th, 1944, meaning, of course, that Svenner would have all of a couple months of active service, just shy of 3. Operation Overlord was to be the first major assignment. No one could have expected it to also be the last. Regardless, Svenner was assigned to Bombardment Force S of the Eastern Task Force. This would see her assigned to support the landings on Sword Beach alongside a far more famous name, HMS Warspite. Several other warships joined them, from the less famous Ramillies to cruisers and destroyers, with the second group also including another exile warship, the Polish Dragon. Warspite would open fire first around 5 a.m. on June 6, 1944. While the big guns were pounding German shore positions, Svenner took up escort duty, covering the battleship, yes, but also minesweepers. Those ships were working to clear a channel to allow the bombardment force a clear path, especially a path closer to the beach. No matter which course of events you subscribe to for Corry, mines were a very real risk at Normandy. That aside, in the process of doing so, the destroyers were making smoke. That was intended to protect the battleships and cruisers from attack. A similar idea to the smoke planes off Utah. However, it would prove to be a bit of a double-edged sword in this regard. While German attempts to contest the landings were generally ineffective, that wouldn't be true here. A handful of German torpedo boats were sent out. Sources differ on this topic, with Drain the Oceans even going for 4. Either way, those boats would charge the Allied formation. Somewhere around 18 torpedoes would be fired into the smokescreen. This would protect the Germans from retaliation, though it also made their salvo a bit of a shot in the dark. A gamble that mostly failed to pay off, as it would turn out. Most of those torpedoes would miss, though a handful came extremely close to Warspite and Ramillies. That would have been a disaster to say the least. Though for the British, they were lucky. None of their ships would suffer a hit. The only torpedo to find its mark would instead slam directly into Svenner, right amidships, breaking the ship in two. Svenner sank within minutes, taking 32 Norwegian sailors and 1 British signalman down with her. 185 men would escape the sinking ship and find rescue. Her wreck remains in place to this day, though the anchor was brought up in 2003. And thus we come to the end of this story. 2 destroyers lost on June 6, 1944, in very different circumstances. Yet both are certainly worth remembering. A reminder that, for all the fame of the landings themselves, the Allied navies bled too, and should not be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.